Do you ever find you have a problem using these marking knives and end up going back to the good old pencil? If you want to do accurate joinery, good woodwork, you really shouldn't be using a pencil for your marking out. You should definitely be using marking knives. So in this video, I'm just going to talk through some of the problems that viewers have told me they have with marking knives and try and get you to use them better, and also teach you how to sharpen them. If marking knives is something completely new to you, then when you think of a knife in woodworking, you're probably thinking of something like a utility knife, like this little Stanley. Now, those knives have what's called a double bevel edge. So your blade will have a bevel on one side and on the other, and they'll come together at an angle which is about 20 degrees. Now, they're lovely and sharp and do some great stuff around the workshop, but they're not made for marking out, and they're not particularly good at marking out. I'll cover the reason for that a little bit later. Well, once you get into actual marking knives specifically made for that task, something like this, you'll find that that has a single bevel. So it's got a flat side, and I've made this prop to show you, one completely flat side, and on the other side it has a single bevel, and they're known as single bevel knives. Now, the angle of that bevel is around 20 degrees, sometimes up to 25. And the angle of the tip, pretty much like a utility knife, round about 30-40 degrees. You can get slimmer knives, like this Japanese one, slimmer with a much sharper angle to the tip, and that just allows you to get into tight spaces for, say, transferring the layout from one joint part to another. So let's take a closer look. This utility knife is what's called a double bevel knife. Bevel on one side, bevel on the other, coming together at the sharp edge. Marking knives have one completely flat side and one side with a bevel, like so. That angle of the bevel, around about 20 degrees in most cases. I sharpen mine with a little micro bevel, which takes it up to about 22 to 25 degrees. We'll cover that during sharpening. But the difference is what you need to understand at this point. The one blade has two bevels on it, the one has a single bevel. Now, why is one better than the other for marking out? What we normally mark out against will be a tri-square. So something like this. I've mocked up something a little bit bigger here, so it's more obvious. So if we put that square on our piece of wood we want to mark out, if we use a utility knife, put the knife up against the square, and if you look closely, you'll see that the tip of the knife, the actual cutting blade, isn't touching the edge of the square. It's offset because of the bevel. So to actually get it to cut right next to where we put the square, we'd have to actually lean the knife across. Now you can do that, and obviously it will work, but you need to be able to rest that bevel against the side of the square. And we're talking about something really quite small, down to perhaps a 1/16 of an inch, and you've got to rest your bevel on that and get it exactly right so that your tip marks the line exactly where you want it. A little bit tricky. Whereas if you use the single bevel marking knife, you've got the whole of that back surface which is flat, just rest that up against the square and your cut will be exactly against where the square is lying, exactly where you want it. So, quite clearly, single bevel knife makes marking out easier and more accurate. Now, I'll just mention carpentry and trades that are not quite as obsessed with accuracy. It's obviously quite possible there to use a pencil or a double bevel knife, and perhaps you'll be within half a mil of where you wanted to put your line. If you're building a house, that's not going to make a lot of difference, but if you're building a chest of drawers and you want it nice and accurate, then definitely go down the marking knife route. So what problems can you have using marking knives? Well, I guess the first one is keeping it up against the edge that you're marking against. In this case, an engineer's tri-square, which I much prefer for furniture over carpenter's squares. You could possibly be drawing your knife back and finding that it goes away from the square. Second problem is you can be drawing your knife along the edge and find that you're actually cutting into your square. Worst of all, of course, you slip when you're doing it and you cut your finger. I think every woodworker's probably done that at some point or other. I know I have. So let's try and get over those three problems. So let's look at drifting away from the line. If you hold your knife, hold the blade parallel to the edge that you're cutting across, that's going to help for a start. If you get more contact on a blade than just the very tip, it makes its own track and it wants to follow that track. So if you're not quite parallel, so if you're sticking out this way, drop your knife a bit, then it is going to track away. No question about that at all. If you keep the blade of your knife parallel with the edge you're cutting, you'll find it's an awful lot easier. Another important point here is don't try and score too deeply with your first cut. Make a light pass. Score a line which is nice and accurate, just gives a little track for you to come back and then score it deeper. So you've got both the slight cut you've made holding the knife up against the square, and you're holding the knife up against the square, and you're pulling it straight back towards you parallel to the edge. You've got all those things in your favour. You better make the cut then to the depth that you want. Now the other problem is where you're cutting your line and you end up cutting into the edge of your straight edge square or whatever it is. The reason for that is basically you've angled your blade like that, and you can't do that. You've got to keep it either perfectly parallel or tiny fraction away, and there's no way around that. If you angle a tool towards the blade, then you're going to cut into it. You'll find that your marking knife is harder than probably any edge you're going to be marking against, and it will definitely gouge into it. Now something you can do to get your muscle memory working to keep this parallel is to drop the blade of the knife so it's resting completely on the surface you're cutting. Then just lift it very slightly, but keep the heel of the edge below the top of your guide. So if your cutting edge is below the top of the guide, there's no way you're going to be able to gouge into it. So practice cutting like that, get your muscle memory working, and then gradually you'll find you'll be able to raise the knife to a point where actually it cuts a lot easier. You can imagine if you've got the whole of the blade or a large portion of the sharp blade in the work, then it creates a lot of drag, and the easiest way to do it is if you're just cutting with the tip of the knife. So muscle memory and then slightly raise, and you'll find that you will be able to raise the heel here of the blade above what you're cutting, above the guide, and you won't cut into it. Don't try and hold something like this and cut along like that. If you slip with your knife, come up over the edge, then you could cut your finger. So something like a square, if you clamp it using the work with the thumb, fingers onto the stock, pull it nice and tight, then you've got to come an awful long way with your blade to actually cut anything. The other thing is, if you're running the blade parallel, if you're putting in a light cut first of all and then coming back for the deeper ones, you don't need terrific pressure against the blade of the guide. You don't have to be pushing really hard, and so even if you come up above the guide, which is most unusual, but if you did come up above it, you're not going to slip across too far. Now let's demonstrate using the real equipment. This engineer's square, we put it on the wood, it wants to tilt away. Now you can get devices that will hold the stock up, save it from doing that, but in most cases you won't have that there. You'll want to put your finger on the blade to hold the stock up and then hold the square. Now if you leave your finger here, there's a good chance if you do slip with a knife that you'll cut it. So once you've got your square in place, you can move that finger back like so. You can put your finger on the blade of the tri-square, rock it up, but doing it right up here by the stock, you've pretty much already come past it with a knife, so there's very little chance of you slipping and cutting a finger there. Alternatively, you could remove this finger entirely, just holding on the stock. So watch out where you put your fingers. Now one other problem that does occur is when you're marking, because you're pressing so hard against the edge here, you can move it. With a tri-square, maybe you'll twist it. And obviously that's going to ruin your mark out. So it's not to do with using the knife in this case, it's to do with how you hold your equipment. If it's a ruler, you've got to have a lot of pressure down on it to make sure it can't move. When it's a tri-square, you've got to be holding the stock right up tight against your face edge or face side to make sure it can't rotate. And that means I'm putting a lot of pressure back here as well, because that will avoid the rotation. If I only hold it up at this end, maybe like that, you can rotate quite easily. But if I hold it, or even if I hold it tight at this end, I can still rotate. But if I put some pressure along that stock, then there's no way it's going to rotate. So how do we sharpen a marking knife? Well, if we go back to this and I look at it just from the side, you'll see that looks very much like the profile of a chisel. So totally flat on the back, flat along here, then a bevel, and what I do, a little micro bevel on the end. So just like a normal chisel. How would you sharpen a chisel? Well, this edge would be straight in front of you, straight across in front of you I should say, and we would work back and forwards on the stone like so. Well, that's exactly what you do with a knife, or what you can do with a knife. It's what I do with a knife. Now you can use oil stones, water stones, diamond plates, which is what I'm using here. Any sharpening system you like, in the same way that you would sharpen a chisel. I'll demonstrate with this knife, which has got just the one bevel. First of all, what I would do is take a couple of strokes, light strokes, on the flat back. Then flip it over to the angled side. And it really depends on what is most comfortable for you. You can do it towards yourself, like so. You can do it away from yourself, like so. Or you can do it from side to side, or at an angle. It really doesn't matter. Just know that what you're doing is sliding that bevel, sharp edge first, away from you, or in that direction. That's the cutting direction. Equally, I could do it like so. And what we're looking to do is just turn a slight burr along the edge. Now, how do you know you're at the right angle? Well, your knife is going to come with a bevel already set up on it. So if you take yourself a marker pen, mark the edge, and then just try. First of all, try almost flat. Turn over, you'll see none of that marker's disappeared. So raise the angle up a bit more. Still nothing. Bit further up. And in fact, on the diamond stone you can see the ink starting to come off, so you know you're getting close to what the correct angle is. And when you've got the right angle, you'll see that micro bevel, all the ink disappears from it, and it won't be long before you can feel a very slight burr all the way along the edge. Once you've done that, flip it over, single flat stroke, helps to remove or at least bend back over that burr. Wipe off any lapping fluid you might have on there, and then we can use a little strop. This is just a little tiny strop, great for little knives. Basically a piece of MDF with a scrap piece of leather stuck on top. I'll put some honing compound, just wipe that over the top, and then same angle but working in the opposite direction here, so I'm working away from the sharp edge. Then flip it over and draw it flat on the back side. So that should be ready to go. Most marking knives have one bevel on the one side. In this case it's on with the point down like so. It's on the right hand side, and that's called a right hand marking knife. And you can get a marking knife with a bevel on this side instead, which would be a left-handed one. But quite usefully, you can get a knife which has got two bevels on the one side. So you can use it this way, or you can flip it over and use it that way. Now, having gone to the trouble to sharpen it, you should look after it. And I've been promising myself a proper case for ages, but this piece of expanded foam will do for now. So I hope that's taught you something about marking knives, how to use them, how to look after them, how to keep them sharp. If you don't have a marking knife yet, that's something I'm going to be making during the week, so hopefully there'll be a video up not too long. See you next time. Cheerio. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments, and please do remember to like and share.